Welcome to the Second Bite podcast, where we talk with top entrepreneurs and CEOs about creating valuable companies through creative transactions. Now, let's get started with the show.
Welcome. This is Todd Taskey. We are back at the Second Bite podcast. I have a terrific guest with me today, Mike Vertal from Rivet Logic / Crafter CMS. We're going to get into both of those things. We're super excited to have you, Mike. So thanks for being here with us.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite. Looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah. And just before we jump in, I want to thank our sponsors, which are the good people at eCohen. eCohen is a accounting firm. They offer a full suite of accounting services and consulting services. I've used eCohen quite a bit. They really help organize and present financials in a way that helps maximize value, whether that's from a transaction or from an investment. They've got a full suite of accounting services. They are perennially on the best places to work list. Forbes magazine calls them one of the most recognized and referred to accounting firms. So if you need accounting help or consulting, you can find them at ecohen.com. So with that business out of the way, Mike, thank you again for being part of the podcast. You and I had a great experience back in the midst of COVID, actually, and we'll touch on that a little bit. There's two pieces here that I really think are going to be fascinating for the podcast. You and I worked on a services business called Rivet Logic. We're going to talk about that. You guys did what a lot of CEOs would really like to do, which is to either create or spin out a software or SaaS business. And I want to spend the entire second part of our time together talking about how you successfully did that, because I think understanding that would really be helpful for the people watching the podcast. Why don't we start with, tell me about Rivet. Tell me the services that you guys provide / provided, who you did it for, and the approximate size of the business, if you will.
Sure. Yeah. Rivet Logic was a IT services business, approximately 100 employees at the time. And we served mostly Fortune 2000 companies and some other great brands. Customers like Marriott, Lamb Research, Sargento Foods, Dropbox. We had some higher ed companies, institutions like Northeastern University, Johns Hopkins. And while we were mostly commercial and higher ed for the full history of the company, in the just in the recent past, within the last couple of years before we sold, we started to get into the government business, especially the Intel and DoD space through a partnership we had with AWS. So that played a factor in the acquisition.
And the services you provided to those customers, Mike, focused on what?
It was really custom software development. Initially, it was implementing management portals, operation solutions for these major companies. We did it on a handful of open source platforms that we were the world's best in. So we were the implementers on top of these open source solutions, and we customized, built out the full solution for the customers. And then around 2014, 15, we started to introduce managed services into the equation as well. So we would do the implementation, get it into production, and more customers around that time also wanted us to manage the 24/7 operation of the solution as well.
And somewhere in there, while you were doing that, became the kernel of what eventually became its own business, right? Which is Crafter. Can you talk about the real origination of that?
Yeah. Well, what we did in the market, competitive market, so to differentiate ourselves, we contributed and created open source software ourselves. So we created many open source projects. Generally, they were add-ons or accelerators, helped us compete in the market, win business, and during the implementation would help accelerate, improve the quality of the solution. And what turned out to be Crafter CMS, was one of many open source projects that we had started along the way, and it just turned out to be the most successful. It gained a lot early on with some big customers, and kind of life of its own.
Great. So now I'm going to put a pin in that and circle back to it in a second, because the first part of the story, actually, the preview before we started our story, is one that I think has a lot of good lessons in it for people that are watching and listening. So you and I got together in January of 2020, a couple months, I guess, before COVID hit full force. But you were engaged with a firm to sell the company a year before that didn't turn into a transaction. Can you talk about, in your opinion, why you don't think it did, and maybe the lessons learned from that?
Yeah, I think the main lesson learned was not to focus too much on who you think the acquirer or set of acquirers are going to be, because you don't know who it's going to be. This is my third exit in my career. My first as the CEO, but previously I had a couple exits as co-founder and VP, as part of an executive team that we had sold. And in those cases, we sold to companies who we already knew we were working with in some capacity, either as a partner or as a vendor or customer. So we engaged another investment banking firm, like you said earlier on, who had some good, really strong relationships with a few of who we thought, right, at that time would be good acquirers. We had already had some conversations going on with them separately, and had some relationships built with them. But as we went through the process, it didn't work out, right, for various reasons with any of them. And I mentioned the government business that we had recently got into. So we had won a very large government contract in the intelligence agency, DoD space. And again, this firm was really focused entirely on large commercial enterprises, and they had no contacts in the government space. So they couldn't generate, the interest and generate the value for what we had in that growing part of our business. So when that became apparent, we terminated that relationship, and that's when I started reaching out to my network to look for someone else that could cast a wider net for us.
Now, interestingly, so you reached out to a firm, you reached out to your network. One of the groups in that network was an investment banker at a larger firm here in the Washington, D.C. area. They said, "We're not right for you. You're not right for us, but you should go talk to Tasky because he'll do the right job for you."
Exactly.
Were you surprised that, because we're a smaller bank than the guys you used the first time and the guys that you went to the second time, were you surprised and or skeptical that a smaller kind of boutique firm could do the job?
No, I think after having the conversation with you and some others, it was about the work you're going to put into it, the contacts, understanding our business, and being able to understand the value of the business that we're trying to sell, and so really I had full confidence.
Excellent. So, and actually, I think we lived up to that confidence, because we were in the middle of some things that we had just finished, and so there was a couple of opportunities that were immediate. And in fact, we started in January, if I remember right, and by March, we had a signed LOI from a small private equity group, and that was like the beginning of March. By the middle part of April, they were, thank goodness, honest enough with us to say, we've got our hands full with a couple, burning issues with other companies, and we're not going to be able to focus on due diligence and the rest with you.
Yeah, with COVID. Exactly.
Yeah. So
I think that the timeline was actually a little bit shorter in both respects. We started getting LOIs in February, and we had a signed one, I think, late February, and we started the due diligence process in early March. And that's when COVID was starting to hit, when the lockdowns, it was really that NBA game where NBA said we're canceling the season, and then things just started cascading from there. We were in the early stages of due diligence, and you could kind of tell in the room, the few meetings we had, that they have some serious reservations about moving forward. So, and that obviously also raised concerns on our end, because who's going to want to buy a company with all this uncertainty arising. But by April, we had more LOIs coming in.
Yeah, we did a good pivot there. We found what ultimately was a really good buyer in a company that wanted to grow out their commercial endeavors, right? With a company called Vertal in Rockville, which is the ultimate acquirer.
Yep. Yeah, they were a government contractor, so they appreciated the business we were bringing on that part of it. But still, the bulk of our business was commercial. We had great brands, Fortune 500 companies, some of whom were impacted quite a bit by COVID. We had some big travel and hospitality customers, but the stuff we were doing for them was mission critical. So even though even through COVID, they still had to maintain those systems, but there certainly was effect, some effect to the top line.
We were updating contracts literally on a weekly basis with the buyer, if you remember that, like what was coming on, what was going off, what they were doing.
Right.
So it was an interesting and dramatic time. Was there anything in specific or particular that you remember or surprised you about so let's move on now, right? So we got released from the first private equity group. Now we're kind of in early April. We kind of hit on this opportunity with Vertal, but we had another group that was really interested and got LOIs from both of them.
Right.
Was there anything that kind of stood out in that process that surprised you or was memorable?
Well, I think that given COVID, that we were continuing to get multiple LOIs and negotiating hard on those. And so we were able to generate multiple lines of interest, kind of play them off each other. I think there was some interesting dynamic with one of them who didn't realize it was competitive. Maybe they thought they were the only game in town, but it was competitive. And we went with what we thought was the best, not just the financial deal, but the best long-term partner for Rivet Logic. You're selling a business. It's not a one-off transaction. You're not selling a pizza, right? You're selling a business with employees and executive team that you've worked with, customers that you want to maintain relationships with.
And it was going to be an important relationship between Rivet and Crafter.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. So, I think all those things are true in any case you're selling a services business. But in our case, because Crafter and Rivet Logic had a partnership and will continue to have a growing partnership there, it was even more critical to have
and that partnership today is that Rivet, as a part of Vertal, does implementation of Crafter software.
Exactly. Yeah. So we sell the software. Yeah. And they and other partners, implementation partners, build out the full solutions for the customers.
So now let's talk about Crafter. And let me Tell me about Crafter, size, what they do, and in particular, there's a lot of CMS softwares out there. Crafter's getting really, really good traction from significant customers. What's the why is that happening?
Well, let me put my Crafter CMS
there. Looks great on you. There you go. Our first 10 listeners that call in can get a Crafter hat just like that.
There you go. Exactly. So Crafter software is building a modern content management platform for digital experiences of all types. The content management market has been around since websites have been around, 20, 30 years now. And most CMSs, content management systems, were built 20, 30 years ago to manage pages on a website. They restrict the developer tools that you use to build the end user experience. And things have moved on, right? It's the modern era is all about multi-channel. It's about different types of experiences, not just websites, even though that's still a major part of it, but mobile apps, augmented reality experiences, OTT video experiences. All these things from an end user perspective have evolved, and the tools and the methods and the processes that software development organizations, software development teams within organizations use today have moved way beyond the rigid systems of the past. So we're addressing that need, servicing the same types of customers, and because Crafter was born out of Rivet Logic, and part of the advantage you get of incubating a product or a technology within a services business is you get to see where the gaps are. You see where the pain points are of existing systems as you're solving problems for real live customers, real live enterprises. And that's where Crafter was born. So it's addressing the needs there that we uncovered as things evolve. A lot of this has been obvious to many others as well. There's a competitive market. There's always new players, but we have some particular insights that's resulted in some of our unique differentiators. So we got continue to grow Crafter along with our partners, and we've got customers like eBay, MasterCard, PGA Tour, U.S. Navy, U.S. Army, and many others.
Yeah, I mean, you have a great client list. Let me ask you this. So Rivet, back at the beginning, you had you and three others, so 4 founders to the business. Was the mindset that we're going to start a services business and we're going to keep our eye open for an opportunity to turn into software? Or did you just want to do good work for customers and then along the way realize, wow, people keep asking for this?
Yeah, it was really more of the latter. We started Rivet Logic to satisfy a market need that we saw at the time. Open source was being adopted by major enterprises, and it was moving up the stack. Right, Linux at the operating system layer and middleware was already proving itself, but open source applications were just emerging. Venture capital was going into there, and I mentioned my other ventures, they were all VC backed or corporate finance backed, corporate venture backed. And I didn't want the hassle of outside investors, boards, complicated boards, taking up time. So we started Rivet Logic as a closely held company, like you said, with 2 co-founders, an early employee who then we gave equity to, and that was our focus, was just building a great services business. And like I said, Crafter was just one of many open source tools that we built to differentiate ourselves in the market, and it took on a life of its own. And that's really for those entrepreneurs out there, as you mentioned, that are looking to do something similar. To me, that's the most important attribute of a successful spin out, is something that grows organically based on market need, customer need, and you're able to prove that product market fit through the course of different processes, customer implementations, and then once you've proven that, then you can start treating it as a separate.
Let me double click on that for a second. So, all entrepreneurs, the glass is half full, and they're looking for opportunity and all. So there's a fine line in there somewhere when you create a tool, because we've got lots of guys that have tools that accelerate implementation, make implementation quicker, less expensive, all those things.
Yeah.
And it feels like in a lot of those instances, they say, wow, this could be software. Let's make this software. And they kind of run headlong into that. It sounds like you're saying, be a little more patient and listen a little bit longer to see if that request repeats itself. Was that the experience with Crafter?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the timeline in Crafter was we launched the first websites on the first very small kernels of Crafter back in 2008. We set up Crafter Software, the company, initially as a subsidiary of Rivet Logic in 2019, 2020, that it really was.
So you set that up, you beeped just a click a little bit there. You set up the subsidiary in 2018?
2013.
2013. Okay.
Right.
And so when you set it up as a subsidiary, same management team, same everything, you just started now to keep separate books for Crafter?
Right. Exactly. It was a separate company owned by the parent company, but separate financials.
And give me a rough idea. How big was it, either as a dollar amount or a percentage of Rivet's Logic, that when you finally said, wow, this is something that we might be able to spin off one day, let's set it up separate?
Right. Well, in terms of revenue, it was generating a lot of consulting business, right? It was generating probably a third of Rivet Logic's consulting business at the time, but that was consulting. It wasn't software. It was when we started selling, because customers demanded, they asked, hey, we're running now this Crafter thing you gave us, you built into our solution. We love it. We want 24/7 support for this, just like any other software vendor would provide us.
Right.
So we started selling an annual support contract to go along with the implementation. And once I started seeing that, that was the time I said, okay, this is a different business model. This is a recurring business model. We're selling support subscriptions, so we need to treat it as a separate business. And that's in 2013 when we set.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you to comment further on that, because I think where I see a lot of guys is right where you were saying. And they say, we've got technology, right? We've got a platform, we've got SaaS, we've got a software.
Right.
And when I ask about revenue, they tell me, or God, last year generated probably $3 million or whatever the number is, but it's consulting. It's not software revenue, but it's responsible for. So that's not a standalone software company. And it sounds like you would agree with that.
Yeah.
And it's when that software is starting to generate its own revenue base, whether it's as selling the software or as maintenance to that you would advise others, maybe you got something here you want to spin out separately.
Yeah, with the emphasis on maybe, because selling a couple doesn't mean anything, right? And selling it to the customers you know very well is pretty easy, relatively, than selling just the software to a whole new enterprise. That's a whole nother level, right? So you don't want to get too overconfident too early in that model. You've really got to prove it in multiple across multiple dimensions.
Right. And by the way, we've done many very successful transactions getting clients the higher end of the range because they have unique IP that either allows them to do implementations more rapidly, allows them to charge a premium, allows them to charge a discount and still be profitable. So it's not as though it's wasted money, right? From that standpoint, but also to keep in mind that the buyers are also going to be concerned about, the black hole that could certainly represent if you're selling it early in the process.
Right.
So now that we've said that, so now you guys realize, geez, we might really have something here. So you created a separate, you named it, you created a separate company. And how did you divide personnel, revenue, accounting? How'd you go about doing that?
Yeah, well, we had a separate corporate corporation set up. And really outside of the ownership, where the parent company was the single shareholder at the time, it was treated as a separate business, separate brand, separate set of accounting books, all the legal stuff. And again, that's one thing you want to make sure you get right up front, because there's a lot of tax consequences with doing this. So if you wait too long, you're going to get burned by the IRS, because you can't just transfer assets from one company to another or from one company to shareholders
If they have
without having a tax consequence.
Right.
You know, because even though it's the same, you're giving it to yourself, or the IRS doesn't care. You're going to pay tax.
And you got really good advice, both legal and tax at the time.
You got to get that up front. Exactly.
And who did you get that from?
Well, our law firm from very early on was DLA Piper. So they're expensive, but they do great work and they do it right. You know, so
and who did you work with at DLA?
Jeff Lair, he's in charge of the emerging technology VC group here in the DC area. So yeah, I definitely would recommend them. But really, any major, law firm or legal team, it could be a small team, but you want it done right up front.
Yeah. And they give you advice both legal and tax?
Tax is kind of a mix between your accounting firm and legal. So there's some overlap there. We had a same thing. I think one of the things, good things we did up front was day one set up, got a accounting and tax firm that I started working with really when I set up Rivet Logic. And so they had the books, they had it all separate from day one. So all the bookkeeping, all the accounting, all the tax was handled by them separately. It was really normally in an enterprise, you're going to have a controller and your CFO. They were really that separate entity that made sure we were doing things right from the outset. So when we set up another company and started setting up another set of books, all the details there with our tax and accountants was worked out correctly from the outset.
There's plenty of guys that would say, Jesus, Mike, you're way overspending on these guys. You're a small, but your mentality was different though. Why was that? Because your past transactions?
Yeah. I mean, exactly. I've seen, not just my own experience, but my friends, colleagues, network, who stories, you hear, where things weren't set up right at the outset, and they can tank a deal much later on, or really cost you a lot more. I've seen other companies who've tried to do this go from consulting to software, and I see them, and they're starting to sell that software recurring contracts, which is an asset that you want to have for the software business, but not necessarily for the consulting business. And once that starts building, you take outside capital, you've pretty much eliminated your option to sell this consulting business. You're basically, those kind of companies just have to transform into a software business only. The consulting business, they lose.
And that's a multi-year at best process.
Yep.
So let me ask you this. Your day one, you've set up Crafter. We've got a new entity. We've got all this. Day two, got all the same people around the room, right? You've just, what were the first steps to build out Crafter as its own shop, and tie that in with somebody that's thinking about this? What would be the two or maybe three things you would say to them? You got to make sure you get this right up front.
Yeah. Well, you got to realize what is it you're selling? What is it you're doing with the spin out? And in our case, we had ongoing development and we had support. Everything else was in the consulting side of the house of actually doing the implementations. So we really just carved out a small team that was going to do ongoing development and the actual support, deliver the support that the customers were buying on an annual subscription basis. So initially we had just a couple contracts. And so we had a team of maybe five or six we carved out separately for ongoing development. We had a roadmap of things we wanted to do, prove out in the model, prove the product market fit, not just with our consulting customers, but with others. So that's how we started, with a handful of people and focused just on what they were doing, what needed to do, build out the roadmap and support customers.
And did you continue to manage both Crafter and Rivet Logic personally?
Yeah, well, I think let me just do my window here. I've got some maintenance folks. Yeah, so like I mentioned, the team it's a team effort. It's got to be a team effort. So had a great team. Continued to recruit team members for both companies, and then over time, initially I was CEO of both companies, and then over time I became chairman of Rivet Logic, executive chairman of Rivet Logic, and CEO of Crafter, and that was the case up until the acquisition.
And to be fair, that really helped with the transaction because Ali could run the business on a day-to-day basis while you could help me focus on the things that the buyers were looking for. I mean, it is great that we were able to get offers in, a couple of months back in February, and then new offers again in March and April. But it was you feeding that material that they were requesting rapid fire that allowed us to keep momentum moving pretty quickly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, once you sign the LOI, the due diligence starts, and you want that to move quickly, but you got to be able to respond to that. So being executive chairman of Rivet Logic, having a great management team to continue running the business, because you don't want the consulting business to suffer while you're going through this acquisition process. Meanwhile, you want the software business to continue to grow, right? And don't want to have any missteps there. So had a great set of management teams on both sides by that time. And if we had done that, tried to do that earlier, many years earlier, it wouldn't have worked because we didn't have that executive team leadership in place, and all the employees. At the end of it, it was the executive team, all the employees, many of whom participated through equity or options in the transaction.
So, last couple of questions, and I'll start to bring us to an end. So, let's say I'm a CEO, and I've got technology, and we've actually implemented our technology with some customers, and we think it could be a software. From the time that we start to sell that as a software, and it generates its own revenue and it generates its own service and maintenance contracts, what would you counsel me as far as the time frame to be able to have something real to spin out so I could just sell the consulting firm versus having the consulting firm with IP that helps me get maybe the higher end of the range on a transaction? How should I just think about the appropriate time frame that might take me to go through what you've done? Would it take 5-8 years?
I think it depends on how many resources you're putting on it. What is the software business or the software product? In our case, it's a pretty complex platform. We're not a turnkey, simple SaaS solution that you can just turn on to some end users and get going. We're a developer platform that requires implementation services to build out a solution and a launch that usually takes several months of implementation. So, and there's a lot, and we're addressing the Fortune 500 market, right, and large government organizations and others that have lots of complex needs. So we were building a very substantial platform, so it took longer. So it could have been a couple of years if it was a smaller targeted SaaS product. So I'd say it really depends. The only thing I would say is it's going to take longer than you think.
It always does, right?
That's right. So plan for twice as much as you really think it's going to take.
At twice the cost.
And you want to be in a market that's ripe for disruption and growing and big, right? You want to be trying to create a whole new market or be playing in a small little segment. The timing is right in terms of where the market's going. You got to have that insight and where the market opportunity is. When is it ripe for creating that market or disrupting an existing market? And then what resources do you have to put on it, right? We wanted to continue to build a consulting business and do that in a profitable manner, which we were able to do, but take some of those profits and put it into Crafter, and that's not an easy thing to do, right? I mean, you have to recognize that's an investment. You're got to put your VC hat on, and in addition to running the consulting business, you got to look at yourself as an investor, and as you invest in a spin out technology or product, because that's gonna your time, the money is gonna compromise the size and growth of the consulting business. We could have been much larger if we would have just focused on just the consulting business. We passed up some opportunities that would have been huge if they hadn't been competitive what we were doing with Crafter. Right. So those are all the factors you need to take into account.
Mike, this was a great deep dive in a short period of time. Let me end with this question, because you're what I would consider a success, right? You've built a couple of now successful businesses. You've got a successful family life and a marriage and balance and all the rest that people aspire to. I'd like to ask you about a group, a person, and a book that perhaps has made a lasting impact on you that still resonates with you today.
Yeah, it's hard to nail down one particular person, role model. I think what's helped me is I like to read biographies of successful people. So that's been a key factor for me. Some not so well known, not just the Steve Jobs' stories and things like that, but there's a lot of stories of success, not just in business, but in all aspects of life.
Any that jump to mind?
Well, one early on in my career, T.J. Rogers, he's CEO of Cypress Semiconductor, kind of a mid-tier, it's not Intel, but they're a very successful semiconductor company. He wrote a book called No Excuses Management. So that's just one example. I like to read, biographies of guys like, the Titans, Rockefeller, Carnegie, and even I've been getting into recently Marcus Aurelius, going back to the Roman Empire.
Wow.
And his philosophy. So I would say really stay curious, continue to learn, continue to read, and think critically about what's coming in at you from different sources. And at the end of the day, take some risks. Things don't get done unless someone's taking a risk.
Excellent. And we will continue to watch Crafter develop into what I know you are hoping and aspiring that it will be. So I'll definitely wish you well there. This, like I said, was great to have you on as a guest. I appreciate you sharing as openly and honestly as you have. We look forward to continued success for you, Michael. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Todd.
Thanks for listening to the Second Bite podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.